Dr. Allan R. Stevens, and he is a native of Ephraim, Utah. He attended Snow College, Utah State, and BYU. At BYU, he earned his PhD in ecology, and for the last 33 years, he's been teaching here at Snow. He has also worked extensively in wildlands in the western United States, and his work includes research and consulting on restoration of disturbed lands, grazing management, and threatened and endangered species. So Allan loves to be at the outdoors. He loves to hunt, hike, and ride ATVs. And today his presentation is titled "The Effects of Climate Change and Political Change on the Pastoral People of Ecology and Ecology of Mongolia." So let's welcome Dr. Stevens.
Sambano. Hello in Mongolian. There's some, if you ever go to Mongolia, you want to learn Sambano. And most important thing you want to learn is, well, that means where's the bathroom? It's kind of, but I had the opportunity this last summer to go to Mongolia for 2 weeks. It was a study abroad program sponsored by the Council for American Overseas Research Centers, and then, which is kind of the logo on the right, and then the tour was put together by ACMS, which is American Center for Mongolian Studies. I love Mongolia. I've always wanted to go. It was one of my bucket list things to do. I'm actually trying to save money to go back. It was so wonderful. The people there, unbelievable. I've been in a few places throughout the world. I never felt unsafe in Mongolia. It was a great place. Picture here, I actually was able to be led around on a Bactrian camel. The Bactrian camels are native to Mongolia. They're two-hump camels, not one-hump camels. So you can kind of see that. So Mongolia, just to kind of give you an idea, it's actually wedged in between Russia and China, and that'll become a little bit more important later, but they call it the land of the blue skies. It's wide open country, a lot of it, and you'll see it's really beautiful. So Mongolia has a population of about 3.4 million people. About 1.6 million people live in the capital city of Ulaanbaatar, which is right here. So almost half of their population live in one city. It's the least populated country in the world. If you divide the total, the area of Mongolia is about 604,000 square miles, or a little bit more than that. If you divide that by number of people, there's about 6 people per square mile. You get outside of UB, which is what they call Ulaanbaatar, it's a lot less than that. So I like places with no people. It was wonderful for me. If you like places with people, Mongolia is not the place to go unless you're going to UB. So just a little bit about the political history of Mongolia. Most of you have heard of the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire started in about 1206 with a fellow named Chinggis Khan. You probably heard it pronounced Genghis Khan. That's the westernized saying. They don't like that over there, so Chinggis Khan. Chinggis Khan actually means universal ruler. The Mongol Empire was at its peak in about 1279, and you can kind of see this map. They ruled most of Asia and actually probably half of Europe. And in about, the Mongol Empire started to fall apart in the 1300s, and by 1500s, they were back to their original area of Mongolia, and it was a number of monarchical, tribal kind of political situation after that for a while. In 1921, Mongolia became the second country to become communistic behind Russia, and it became kind of a satellite state. It never became part of the Soviet Union. It actually remained as an independent state that was communistic. And then in 1990, when all of communism was falling apart, it became a democracy. And one thing I should mention is that because they're wedged in between Russia and China, they try to appease everybody politically. They try to make friends with everybody. When I was there, the president of Belarus was there, which Belarus is kind of a pariah country right now. I also went to some meetings with the Prime Minister, or kind of equivalent, of North Korea, the United States, Canada. There was a bunch of European countries, China, and Russia. They were all there together, and they just try and be friendly with everybody politically. So they're kind of in a bad situation. They don't want to tick off either Russia or China because they're superpowers, and Mongolia is not a superpower. Ecologically, that's kind of what I want to talk about. Ecologically in Mongolia, most of Mongolia is above 5,000 feet in elevation. So it's high elevation like us. It's fairly far north in latitude, about the Canadian United States border as far as latitude north. It's a really high plateau, and there's really kind of three major types of ecosystems they have in Mongolia. In the far south there in the pink, that's desert areas, and then the white and the yellow in the middle, those are what they call the steppes, and that's where I was mostly in the steppes. And then kind of far north and in the west, they have some really big mountains with forests and alpine regions and kind of tundra area, okay? So this is kind of what the deserts of Mongolia look like. Just some examples of the desert ecosystems. This is the steppe. And I'm going to mostly be talking about the steppe specifically, but also because that's kind of where I went. But the steppe, it's wide open country. Mongolia is really weird compared to any other country in the world. One of the really cool things is you very rarely see a fence. You might see a little corral someplace, but you don't have fences anywhere. It's just wide open. You can see forever. It reminded me a lot of being in the valleys of the West Desert of Utah or in Nevada. Actually looks very, very similar in a lot of ways, but it's very different ecologically. So these steppes are basically just huge grasslands with very few trees. And the mountain ranges, as you can see, don't have a lot of trees on most of the mountain ranges and the steppes. They're just big, wide open grasslands, very beautiful country. And then the mountain regions, I actually hiked up a mountain near UB. It was raining that day, I almost froze to death. This is in, July, end of June, 1st of July. You can see me there on the left. But they have these big conifer forests. The conifers there are really weird. You guys wouldn't recognize them in a way. In the summer you would. They look like pine trees, kind of. But in the winter, the leaves turn yellow. And that's kind of what you're looking at up there on the top. And they actually lose their leaves. They're a deciduous conifer tree, which is something that we don't have around here. They're very, very beautiful forested areas. So what I mostly want to talk about are the pastoralist people of Mongolia. For thousands of years, they've lived as a semi-nomadic culture. And they're basically, for thousands of years, they've lived as subsistence, semi-nomadic peoples. And what I mean by semi-nomadic is you can see from those pictures, there's these huge valleys, kind of like the Sanpete Valley where we live. And what they'll do is they actually live in a gur. A lot of people around here call them yurts. They're the big round, those little round houses there. And then they herd animals. How you doing, boy? It's actually from Mongolia. But these semi-nomadic people, what I mean by semi-nomadic is they actually move from one place to another as they use up the forage in those areas. So they'll graze their animal in an area here around their gur, and then they might move down the valley later on in the year, or they might move across the valley. And they kind of have they really don't have an area defined where they can graze. All of the land in Mongolia is owned by the government, and at least all the wide open spaces. In the city, you can actually own some land, but it's very rare out here in the middle of nowhere. And so they'll move around, and in the wintertime, they'll move to a different place in the valley and graze. They don't produce any fodder for their animals. And what I mean by fodder is they don't feed them hay or grain or anything in the wintertime. The animals just graze on the land. And so the grazing resources, the grasses that are there, are critical for this lifestyle. And you can see some of the folks that I saw out in Mongolia. And one of the really interesting things, we actually helped put up this GUR on the top left. We met some people, they were putting up their GUR, they were removing spots, and the lady there had a sewing machine she was fixing some of the materials with. It's an old sewing machine that actually has the hand crank for the needle on the side, which I thought was really cool. But the people that you see there today are much like they were 1,000 years ago, with a few differences that we'll talk about. This is what it looks like inside of a GUR. This little girl just won my heart. She's so beautiful. And that's her grandpa there. But we were invited into some GURs. They had kind of some presentations. I should mention there was 15 of us, 15 community college faculty members that were on this tour. So we all crammed in this GUR, and they taught us about the lifestyle of the Mongolian people. Every pastoralist family have 4 groups of livestock. They either have cows or yaks or both. You can see some cows and yaks in this herd. They have sheep and goats. They're getting more and more goats because what they found is that they can raise Angora goats in Mongolia really well, and that's where you get cashmere from. And so it's a way for them to make money now. So there's a lot more goats than there are sheep now. They also typically have camels, which is the upper left. And they use the camels to move their GUR from place to place, traditionally. Camels are not as critical in today's world as they once were because they have vehicles and so forth now. And then they have horses, and horses are their pride and joy. You don't have a good racing horse, you're just nothing in Mongolia, right? The horses, I'll show you a little bit later, they're kind of small animals. Up in the far north of Mongolia, I didn't go there, but they actually have reindeer, and they ride the reindeer around and use the reindeer for a herding animal. So I wish I could have got up there. So this is me on 3 of the different animals, okay? I was able to ride a yak, very uncomfortable. Don't really want to do that again. The camel, smooth as all get out. And I'm not a really big guy, right? I'm an average, probably a little bit below average sized American. And you can see their horses are really pretty small horses. Most of you would call them ponies. And we were able to ride for quite some distance. And the other problem I had, I'm not really tall, but they couldn't lengthen the stirrups out long enough for me, so that's why I looked cramped up, because people just are not that tall. But I'll tell you, this horse, if I could get a Mongolian horse, I probably would. It has the smoothest gait of probably any horse I've ever ridden. But it was a lot of fun. Traditional saddles, they have wooden saddles and so forth. It was a lot of fun. So, as I mentioned, these people are have been basically subsistence. I'll call them ranchers, pastoralists on the land for thousands of years. And what they do is they use every part of the animal. One of the big things that they use for food is they actually milk their yaks and they milk their horses. And yak milk and horse milk, I fell in love with it. And then they actually produce a tea out of the yak milk or the horse milk. This is yak milk tea. And then what they do is once they milk the animal, they actually put the milk into a jar, or this is more traditional, and it's kind of like a yogurt, and they let it ferment. And then what you're looking at here is they're actually distilling the alcohol off of the milk. So they'll use it, drink alcohol, and then they also use every part of the milk, like the whey, the cream, everything else, and they make tons of these little, I guess you'd call them snacks, and they eat them a lot. And they're different. The different ones that you can see here come from different parts of the milk product. So they use the milk extensively. They also, and you can see me there milking a yak and a horse, and the lady was laughing at us, and Udambor told me that's women's work. That's why she was laughing and joking about us guys that wanted to milk a yak. If you ever get a chance to milk a yak, they have very small teats. I have really small hands. I had a hard time milking the yak because the teats were so small. So you guys might not want to know about that. But they actually use every part of the animal. They actually slaughtered a sheep for us. So the way they slaughter the sheep is really interesting. They tie it up, they cut a little while it's alive, they cut a little slit that's about 4 inches long in their belly, and then they reach down in and they cut the dorsal aorta, which is the blood vessel in there, and then they actually sew it up while the animal's dying. And the reason why they do that is to capture all the blood. And you eat blood, sausage, and basically they eat every part of the animal. Up in the top left-hand corner, it's like the entrails that they had cooked for us. And I tried all of it. Most of it was pretty good. I didn't really like the colon with the meat in it. Just the visual of seeing a colon with like poop in it just didn't appeal to me. But it actually wasn't that bad. I couldn't get past that visual, like view. But what they do is they actually have what they call Mongolian barbecue, and it's nothing like any Mongolian barbecue you've ever been to. They don't have a lot of spices there because they don't raise a lot of spices. But what they do is they have a big vat, kind of like right here, and they put all of the meat in there. And we even ate the head and the tongue and the meat off of the head. Everything they throw in there. They threw a few vegetables in there as well. And then what they do is they heat up a bunch of rocks, and there's a little bit of water in there. It's kind of like a steamer almost. And they throw these hot rocks in with the meat, and that's what cooks them. And that's kind of, of course, some of this is modern stuff, but essentially that's the way they've been doing things for thousands and thousands of years. And that's kind of how they live, is from their animals. The animals, of course, eat grass. And I was just amazed. I'm a plant biologist, so this may not interest you guys, but I was super excited about this. All the grasses over there are rhizomatous, which means they grow underground and asexually reproduce with underground horizontal stems. Most of our grasses around here grow in bunches, right? And a lot of the species are actually the same species. I knew a lot of the plants over there. There was a lot of different plants as well. And so these grasses grow kind of differently than they do in the United States. Now, the reason why they're different there versus here, they actually receive about the same amount of precipitation we do in most places in Mongolia. It's 10 to 15 inches of precipitation, which is about what we get here. We get 12 and a half, 13 on average here. So very, very similar. But what's different is when they get their precipitation. So on the bottom here is the precipitation number in millimeters. You can also see maximum and minimum temperatures. It's a lot dang colder there in the wintertime than it is here, as you can see. But when do we get most of our precipitation here? What part of the year? What season are we going into, guys? Winter, right? Most of our precipitation comes in the form of snow. And then we kind of live on that water throughout the year. We don't get a lot of rain in the summertime or in the fall or in the spring. Almost all of our precipitation comes in the winter. And what happens is our grasses around here, the reason why they're bunch grasses is they have to do that to survive. Because by the time it's middle of summer, we have no precipitation. And those plants kind of have to protect themselves. And the way they do that is by growing in bunch grasses. In Mongolia, you'll notice that they receive all their precipitation throughout the growing season, and so the grasses stay green all summer long and into the fall. And so they're just growing a little bit all throughout the summer, and that allows them to have a lot more grass resources than what we have here. They actually have a lot more grass growth than what we have here in the Utah because of the way that they receive their precipitation. Now, I want you to kind of remember this because we're going to talk about it later. They don't get a lot of snow in the wintertime. Up in the mountains, they'll have some snow, but it's not hardly any snow at all. And that's important because the animals have to be able to find food. And if you're only growing grass this tall, if you get an inch of snow, what's going to happen to those animals? They're going to die. They're going to starve to death, right? So I want you to keep that in mind, right? We talk about climate change. So grasses grow all year round. The one thing is that there's so many grazing animals on this landscape that they really can't produce seed. You very rarely see a flower stalk on a grass plant. Now you guys say, well, grasses don't flower. They do, okay? but you very rarely see that. And so they've evolved this way of reproducing asexually by rhizomes, which is just amazing from a biological standpoint. So I want to talk a little bit about the politics and how that has affected these pastoral peoples, okay? So in the communist era, the pastoralists were put into collectives, and so what the communists were trying to do is they were trying to provide food and so forth for more people. And so they went from a subsistence type of a lifestyle to more of a commercial type of a lifestyle a little bit. And from what I understand from the people, it didn't work very well with the pastoralist people. They just kind of did what they wanted, and they're so far away from anything that they just kind of ignored whatever government was there, right? But what the communists did that was really interesting is they started monitoring all of these rangelands where these pastoralist people were. And they got really good data on, where is there overgrazing? What do we need to do to spread out the animals? If you think about it, animals not only need food, they need water. And so a lot of these pastoral areas are based on river systems, and they have to bring the animals to the river every day to drink, right? Just like you guys have to drink. And so what happens when you have that occurring in grazing management is you tend to have higher grazing around those water areas, right? And then away from the water areas, there's a lot of forage that could be used that nobody's able to use, no animals are able to use. And so what the communists did was they drilled a lot of wells out away from these river areas and actually distributed the grazing animals much better. And from what I understand, the body quality of the animals, in other words, the amount of meat that they produced, the amount of milk that they produced went up quite drastically. And then they also had government scientists. You can say, well, there's not much science to grazing an animal. There's actually a lot of science on how to best get the most meat off of an animal or get it to produce the most milk, right? Which is what you want if you're one of these pastoralist people. And the communists actually sent government scientists out and taught them how to do better, how to grow more animal, how to grow better animals. And overall, the range trends improved throughout Mongolia during the communist era. No, happened here. Something happened. Still not right. There we go. Okay, so what changed when they went to a democracy? I'm going to give you an idea here. Democracy was the worst thing that could have ever happened for these pastoralist people, I think. And, normally we think of democracies as being much better than communistic or monarchical governments. But the way that the democracy evolved in Mongolia, it was probably the worst thing that could have happened for these pastoralist people. What happened was over half the population lives in UB, and so that's where the government focuses all their money and all their resources is on this one big city. And they don't focus any resources out in the steppes, out where these pastoralist people are. And so the water wells were not maintained. Now you say, well, why didn't the herders maintain the water wells? Well, it's like if you and I are, let's say 5 of us are together, and we know that we need to pay money to put a new pump in the well or to maintain the well. Who pays for it, right? Is it you or is it me? Or is it the other guy? And eventually what happened was these wells became derelict. And so none of the wells, or very few of them, are even functional anymore. And they had no government scientists. So we have agricultural research specialists that go out and help farmers do a better job. There's none of that in Mongolia right now. However, they still spend money monitoring the rangeland. So we know what the rangeland condition is, but we don't apply that knowledge to anything anymore in Mongolia, which is really kind of sad, if that makes sense. There also was a big movement from subsistence agriculture to more market-based agriculture. Now, this is what you'll see in Mongolia today. you'll see a herder out there with a cell phone. They say that Mongolia has a higher percentage of their population on Facebook than any nation in the world. Everybody has a phone. Everybody has to have a car or a motorcycle. You can see a motorcycle over here. And those things cost money. And they've never had to sell their animals before. There's no market for these animals, and trying to get these animals to market is extremely difficult. Most of the sheep were not sheared because there's really not a market for their wool, which is kind of sad. And so what happens is a lot of these people have taken out loans to be able to have a cell phone, to be able to have a car. Yet how do they pay it back? How do they get those loans paid back when there's not really a market economy and for them? And again, they get really no support from the government. The government, usually builds a road. Well, you should drive the roads in Mongolia. Even the highways are pretty scary to drive. If you were to drive the main highway that we drove on, if we had that in Utah, people would have an outcry about how the poor conditions of the road. I mean, it's like if you go more than 45, 50 miles an hour, you're taking your life in your hands on these roads. They're not good, most of them. And most of the roads are just dirt roads that are not maintained at all. And so if you're a pastoralist, how do you get your sheep to market? Or how do you get your cow to market? Or how do you get the milk from your cow to market? And it's just not, the government isn't supporting these pastoralist people in any way to help them to be successful. And so the other thing the government did to support the pastoralist people is they give them awards and monetary awards for more animals that they have. Not the body quality of the animals, just the number of animals. So if you raise more animals, you get money from the government. Now, this is really important. This is the number of grazing animals in Mongolia since 1970. As you can see, it's just exponentially grown. These animals, though, there's not enough forage for them. They're in very poor body condition. You can't hardly even eat a lot of the sheep anymore or a lot of the cows because there's no meat on them. They're just raising numbers of animals, and they're not taking young calves to market like we do here. And so with all of these animals, what's happened is they're actually severe overgrazing that's occurring in Mongolia. And then on top of that, for the last 15 or 20 years, the effects of climate change have really hit Mongolia hard. And we'll talk more about that, but it's really hit it hard. So these pastoralist people are trying to make money by having more animals, but yet their animals are not good enough to eat. And then you have climate change on top of that. You have no way to pay back your loan, and so a lot of them are failing. Almost, one paper that I read, almost half the pastoralist people are out of business. They're living in cities, and I'll show you what's happening. It's really, really sad in a lot of ways. So this is now I know that there's different color contrasts, but this is what the forage should look like. It should be a whole bunch of forbs and grasses. This was an ungrazed area that we come across. This is what it looks like. And so it's severely overgrazed, and I can tell that it's overgrazed because there's lots of spaces in here where you just see the soil. And when that happens, there's so little soil resource. Like here we only have topsoil that deep, right? Okay. Same thing in Mongolia, very, very small amount of topsoil. And so what happens is if you overgraze it, then the next time you get a windstorm, which there's constant windstorms over there, you lose your soil resources, and you're never going to be able to grow anything there. That kind of makes sense? So it's kind of problematic. And so that's kind of what overgrazing looks like in Mongolia. I just want to talk about the effects of climate change on top of that. So what's happening with climate change in Mongolia? Well, precipitation is coming at a different time of the year. When we looked at that, most of the precipitation used to come during the growing season of the grasses from the spring to the fall, right? So there's more precipitation coming in the winter months in the form of snow. And that's problematic for the vegetation that has evolved there. It's also problematic for these pastoralist people, and I'll kind of talk about the zoods here in a minute. And then the rainstorms that they get in the summer, from what I understand, of course I wasn't there 20 years ago, but before climate change, you kind of have constant drizzles, like you get a rainstorm and it'll last for like a week, and it's just kind of, you know, constant little rainstorms. Now what happens is the rainstorms come in high intensity, short duration storms. What that means is like it'll rain for like an hour and then it won't rain anymore the rest of the week, or an hour and then an hour later, you know, in the day. And so they're getting, and you guys kind of know what happens when you get a really hard rainstorm. A lot of that water just runs off the land. It doesn't go into the soil versus constantly having, you know, kind of a steady drizzle in these ecosystems. And that's also affecting the amount of vegetation that can grow, okay? So what are the results of climate change? Well, one of them is what they call zood, okay? And the zood means that they get a lot of snow in the winter, and this is the results of the zood. What happens is animals starve to death. And so this last winter, was probably one of the worst zoods they have ever had. They figure they lost, kind of depends on who you talk to, right? But they lost close to 100 million animals starved to death last winter. Okay, or something like that. I can't remember but it was a lot. I mean, they said it was over 1/3 of the grazing animals died. Okay, it's a really bad situation for these people. This is kind of the zood map from 2024, this last winter, and you can see it affected most of Mongolia. Some people got lucky and didn't have the zood, but others did have the zood. Okay, and then the vegetation. The effects of climate change is the vegetation, especially the grasses. They're not growing to the potential that they used to grow to. So they don't have as much forage out there as they used to have, okay? So those are some of the issues that they have with the grazing lands. So what happens when one of these pastoralist people, families, communities, what happens when they fail? So kind of imagine you've taken out a loan so that every kid in your family can have a cell phone, right? And so that you can have a motorcycle, so that you can have a car to move around, and you have to pay for gas and everything else. Now the other thing that they don't have to have, but they want, is almost every GER had a little solar panel on it. And they almost all have a little fridge inside of the GER that's run from that solar panel, which they've never had before. And so those are things that most of us would say, yeah, that's a good thing, right? But they've taken out these loans, and now they have more animals. Those animals are overgrazing the area, and then you have the effects of climate change on top of that. As you can imagine, financially, many, many of these people are failing. Probably at least half of the pastoralist people have failed financially in the last 10 years. Okay? And so what happens to them when they fail? Do they just starve to death? Well, what most of them do is they move to UB, okay? And they take their GER with them, or they buy a new GER when they get to UB. And what they do is they find a little plot of land on the edge of the city, and they set up their GER, and then they try and find a job in the city, okay? This is what they call a GER camp. You can see some brick structures and some metal structures that are built there, right? But you can also see like GERs that people have set up in these outskirts of UB. Now, a lot of people would call these slums, but I wouldn't. A lot of the people don't want to live in an apartment. They like to be independent, and even having a plot of land as big as this stage here helps them psychologically, I guess you could say. The bad thing about living here, some of them have power to them, and you don't want to get into underneath some of their power lines because they steal power and all sorts of stuff. It's not a good situation power-wise, but they still have no running water. They have really nothing else. The only way that they can heat their GER is with wood, and UB in the wintertime is one of the most polluted places in the world. And the reason why is that you have all these people burning coal and so forth, and the government's now providing charcoal, which reduces the effects of, but they're actually adding to climate change by burning all these fossil fuels and all this wood. One thing that I don't know if you can see, but everybody has a little outhouse because there's no running water. And so you have to use the outhouse. And I don't know about you, but when it's 20 degrees Celsius below zero, I don't want to go to the outhouse. I mean, that's just me. But I mean, it's, it's not an easy way of life. They actually have, the government hauls water to water centers throughout the GER district. They have big underground water tanks, and then they have to go buy their water. And so you'll see like little kids, it was summertime so they weren't in school, but they have like these little carts and they'll go fill up these big 5-gallon jugs, multiple times a week and haul them up the hill to their GER. But the people there, as I mentioned, we spent 2 days in the GER district. The people in the GER district, it's not a slum. It's different from a slum. They're happy. They love it, love living a little bit independently of the city itself. And I don't know if enjoy is the right word, but they really like it better than living in the city itself. One of the problems, though, is if you work in the city, UB is terrible traffic-wise. I mean, it's the worst place I've ever been in my life for traffic. Like I'll bet to go from here to here in UB, you're looking at an hour drive. It's just clogged. So these people have to get up at 3 in the morning to get to work at 8 o'clock kind of a thing, and they don't get home until way, way late at night. And so there's some issues there. And anyways, that's kind of what they have there. One other thing, and this is a whole different topic, but I want to just mention it to get you guys thinking. Most of us think education is a good thing. Well, the Mongolian people are very well educated for the most part. But it's different than our education here. Here we talk a lot about underserved populations like females females are really getting kind of equalizing out or close to it here in the United States. In Mongolia, it's just the opposite. The females are educated to the hilt. The males are very uneducated. It's kind of backwards from what it is here in the United States. Almost every doctor, we went to a lot of hospitals and stuff. I only saw, in my travels there, 2 male doctors. When you go to government offices, it's almost all females. The females are very, very highly educated. The males work menial jobs, for lack of a better way of saying it, or they stay out and herd the animals. So it's kind of we had a couple of ladies in our group that were, really pushing feminism, and they just could not wrap their mind around the way things worked in Mongolia. I mean, it was just crazy. Well, crazy to me, crazy to us compared to what we have, right? So what's the good side? What's the opportunities that I think are out there in Mongolia? I think there's a real big opportunity for these pastoralist people to make it, to actually, for this type of lifestyle to be maintained and for Mongolia to really flourish. This is just my own personal opinion, but I think in order for Mongolia to become a really productive country in the world scene, they need to help the pastoralist people become a critical part of their infrastructure, okay? And maybe not everybody has that opinion, but that's my opinion. So as they move to market-based economy, they need some help from the government to be able to move their animals, to market they need markets that they can actually sell their products in, and a way to move their animals to the market. They need to start worrying more about the quality of animal instead of the quantity of animals. So I work with grazers here in the United States, and I have this discussion with them all the time. If you'll decrease your herd from 175, you'll actually make more money. And they just cannot wrap their mind around that because it's hard. But what happens is if you have a certain plot of land, like as big as this room, sometimes if you have more animals, they eat too much and every animal's in poor condition. But if you decrease the number of animals, your animals increase their weight by more than you would have with more animals. I don't know does that kind of make sense? And so I think they need to really focus on that. And in order to do that, they need government, like people that are like the agricultural extension specialists that can help these people understand how to produce a market-based economy versus a subsistence-based economy. Because it's a big change. And so they need help from scientists. They need help. We know what to do. I could tell them textbook what they need to do to be successful. We have the science to do that, but there's nobody to transfer that knowledge to the people. They're still monitoring like crazy in Mongolia. They know what the rangeland is. They know how overgrazed it is, but there's no way to get that knowledge to the pastoralist people, and there has to be that kind of intermediate connection, I guess, built in. And then the other big thing that I think that they have an opportunity of in the more rural areas of Mongolia is ecotourism and hunting. They're starting to do a lot more of this, but I think there's a lot of potential. I saw tourists there from a lot of European countries. There's tons of Koreans and tons of Chinese that are coming to Mongolia to see this unbelievably beautiful country. And to experience, like we went to the one place and they actually had what they call Naadam, which is kind of like a county fair. They had a rodeo, and I mean, it was way cool. And they slaughtered a sheep for us and all that stuff. We were able to see kind of how these people used to live. And I think if airfare prices go down a little bit, there'd be millions of people from the United States that would go to Mongolia. And actually, it's a way that they can augment that subsistence way of living. And then hunting, I'm a big hunter, so if you don't like hunting, that's fine. But there's a lot of things going on. They actually have elk, just like they're the same species of elk that we have. The Argali sheep, the cheapest Argali sheep you can get in Mongolia right now is about $56,000. And there's a lot of Argali sheep. And then they also have the Taki horse, which is up in the right-hand side. It's the only truly wild horse. Scientists think that all horses may have come from the Taki horses. And we were able to see those in Hastai. And it was way cool. So, beautiful country. I'd recommend any of you going to Mongolia. So, I don't know, do any of you have any questions?
So we have about 5 minutes. If you want to wait for to think about questions while the TAs come down with the microphones.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. A lot of the examples you looked at from the pictures and the sort of these kind of trends over time with pastoralism and ranching and grazing and stuff reminds me a little, there's some differences too, but of like the last 100, 150 years here in our valley and on our local Wasatch Plateau. If it's not too sideways from your work and observations here, if you wouldn't mind maybe drawing some comparisons, talking about maybe some differences between management, what we're learning from management, some of the problems, some of the improvements that have been made about how we ranch or graze or
Yeah,
manage
so,
with these lands?
so one thing that's very different, like I said, it looks a lot like western Utah and Nevada when you first, like when you're driving down the road. But the vegetation is very different. But like here, we actually have like agricultural extension specialists, or if you're grazing on government land, there's people that are actually going out there and improving water resources to spread out the animals more. They're actually monitoring how many animals can be on the land at any certain time. They actually, when there is an overgrazing occurring, they'll actually force them to move their animals from place to place. And so there's a lot of differences, but really the weather and the ecosystems are really quite similar. Like I said, a lot of the same species. And we actually have brought in a lot of species from Eurasia, in this part of the world, and we actually have them here and use them for our benefit here. But there's no connect between, there's tons of scientific papers coming out of Mongolia, but there's no way to get that knowledge to the pastoralist people. And nobody to say, hey, try this out. If it works, then maybe we can change things. Because it's just like you and I, if somebody comes and tells us how to do something, our first reaction is go to hell, right? You don't want to be told what to do. But if I can talk somebody in the pastoralist community to make a change, and people see how much more money they're making and how much better their animals look, and so it's kind of a long process to get that to occur. I don't know if that answered your question.
How would we combat the effects of climate change over there?
What's that? I'm sorry.
How do we go about combating the effects of climate change in Mongolia?
So, you know, I mean, they have the same issues that we do with climate change, and the government's trying to alleviate some of the excess pollution by using charcoal instead of coal and pure wood products. And it does reduce the amount of pollution in UV. But, I mean, the effects that they have of climate change are due a lot to everywhere else in the world, right? And so it's much harder, that's a much harder question to address. Kind of, this is my attitude around here. I've seen the effects of climate change. I do a lot of work out in the wilds of Utah. I've seen the effects of climate change. And I've come to the conclusion, yeah, I can do a few things to help combat climate change myself, but I can't do a whole lot myself. But I can teach somebody how to adapt to those changes in climate, right? And so I think that's what they need more than anything else, is somebody to teach them how to adapt. And then if we can turn it around, great, right? I mean, that's kind of what we would all hope for. But if you can't, you have to adapt to what's there or you're gonna die, right? If you don't adapt, you go extinct. That's part of biology.
All right, let's give one last round of applause for Dr. Stevens.
Thanks, guys.
And I'm sure if you have any other questions, I'm sure he's willing to hang out for a couple minutes
Yeah.
to